All right. So let's talk about the next kind of element of what we're going to learn today, which is about using what are called functions in a CSS document. Okay. Now, if you've ever taken, a computer science class where maybe you did an intro to, JavaScript or intro to C++ or something along those lines, what you probably understand is that the the way a real programming language like JavaScript works and the way that HTML and CSS works is a little different. HTML and CSS are not considered programming languages. They're considered structuring languages. What that essentially means is that they can structure data like, you can say, okay, this, I have structured this to be a div, I can use CSS to say its visual style will be this, but that's about as far as it goes. In real programming languages, you typically have the ability to do things, to manipulate information. And to be honest, in HTML and CSS by itself, there really isn't a way to do that. Okay, that is why HTML and CSS are not technically considered programming languages, but instead are considered structuring languages. Okay, languages like C++ or JavaScript or C# or something like that, those would be considered programming languages because you can manipulate data. Okay. Now, even though CSS is not a programming language in the traditional sense, there are some aspects of programming languages that we can use or that are being implemented into CSS. Okay. And the one that we're going to talk about today is called functions. Okay. What is a function? Well, in programming terms, a function is a command that does a task. Okay. The way I kind of say it when I teach programming is a function does something. And I know that sounds really vague because if I'm being honest, it is really vague. A function in a programming language could basically do almost anything. A function could round a number to the nearest whole number. It could, build a circle. It could choose a random number. It could make an application close. Okay. So the point here is that a function can really kind of do almost anything. Okay. The way that we use we've actually been using functions already a little bit. We just didn't really know what those functions were. We didn't know they were functions. We didn't know what they did. Now, the way a function normally works in programming is you usually say the function name, and then you give it a lot of times something called an argument or arguments, plural. Arguments are information given to a function in order to perform the task. Okay. I'm going to give you guys an example of what this might look like in JavaScript. So if I say something like this, random number 0, 10. Okay. Random number is the function. The way you can usually tell a function in most programming languages, it has a name and then it has parentheses. And then 0 and 10 are arguments or information that the function is using to do its task. In other words, I'm saying I would like to choose a number, a random number, and the random number is going to be between 0 and 10. Okay. The way I like to think of it is like if you were going to use Google Maps, for instance, and you were trying to get from point A to point B, like if I was trying to get to San Francisco State University and I wanted turn-by-turn information, Google Maps really needs two things. It needs the starting point and it needs the end point, right? If it doesn't have the starting point and it doesn't have the end point, it can't really give you turn-by-turn information, right? So that's kind of, how we do this. So in this case, it's like, well, if you want to have a random number, you need to have these arguments that give it the information of like, what's the lowest possible number? What's the highest possible number? Okay. Now, you guys have actually been using functions before. We actually have been doing this with the background image and the background using gradients, okay? So just to refresh your memory a little bit, here's an example. I have this section and I have this section. Each one has a little ID on it, element 1 and element 2. So in element 1, I've given it a height, and then we have the CSS property background image. URL is actually the function. What does URL do as a function? Well, it actually goes and gets an external image. In this case, I want to grab this wood texture, okay? So this is the function, and then the argument I'm going to give it is the name of the file, which in this case is wood.jpg. So this is the function. This is the argument. Okay. And if I were to save, and I'm just going to preview this, the result is it gives me this, right? This is the wood texture. Okay. Here I have I'm going to use a gradient. Now, you guys hopefully remember that to do a gradient, we use the background CSS property. The value here is actually a function. The function is linear gradient. What does linear gradient function do? It builds a linear gradient, right? Or we have this, radial gradient. What does that do? It's a function that builds a radial gradient, right? And in this case, the linear gradient actually needs 3 arguments. It needs the direction, or I should say it needs a minimum of 3 arguments. It needs to have the direction and then at least 2 different colors, okay? So in this case, linear gradient is the function, and the arguments or the information that the function needs in order to do its job is this. So I'm just going to call it argument 1, this, arg2, and this, arg3, okay? So this is just an example. I'm just showing you things we've already done. Now, let's see how we might use this idea of functions, okay? I'm going to show you guys some new functions that we haven't used yet, okay? Now, there's a function called calc. Calc is short for calculation. What is a calculation? A calculation just basically means like, computing 2 numbers, 5 plus 5, 10 minus 2, 6 times 4, something like that. Okay. So what it can do is literally do math, as I like to say. So let's go to exercise 8 here. I have a div. Okay. And what I have here is a calc function, and the arguments are 100 plus 100. So what does this really mean? Well, what it will do is it'll calculate what the value, what is 100, what's the value of 100 plus 100? Well, 100 plus 100 is 200. So what's going to happen is this is all going to become 200 pixels, and that is going to be the width of my div. So let's try that out. I'm going to come in here. And if I come and look at this, my div is 200. I can even verify that. Let's do a inspect. And if I highlight this, you can see there, right there, it says 200 in terms of the width. Okay. If I come back and I change this to 500 and 200, well, let's find 200 as a mathematical thing. Well, it's 700, right? So if I save, this would become even longer, right? Because now it's 700. And I can actually add as many numbers as I want. So let's add another, I don't know, 150. So if I add that, now it should become 500 plus 200 plus 150, which off the top of my head, that should be 850, right? And it is, okay. Not only can I do addition, I could also do subtraction. So, 1,000 pixels minus 300 pixels, okay? what's 1,000 minus, 1,000 pixels minus 300? Well, the answer should be 700, right? So if I save and I go back and I look at this, the value is 700. Okay. You can do multiplication too. The way you would do that is, let's say I did 400 pixels star 2. The star means multiplication in programming. What this means is 400 times 2. 400 times 2 would be 800, right? And this is now 800. And you can also do division. Division would be, let's say I did 1,000 pixels divided by 2. The forward slash in programming means to divide. And the result of that should be 1,000 divided by 2 should be 500. So this should now be 500. And there you go. Now, that's cool and everything. You might be going, well, David, that's fine, but why wouldn't I just type in 500? Why do this extra step, right? Seems kind of extra, right? It seems like more busy work when I didn't need to do that. And that's a fair choice or fair thing to say. And I'll talk about why this might come in handy. Right now, I have this div, okay? And let's just say for the sake of argument, whatever size the div is, I want it to be a minimum of 50% of the width of the page, right? Now, we know that I could do 50%, but let's just say for the sake of argument, I always want it exactly 50% of the page plus 200 pixels. Why? I don't know. Let's just go with me here. So I'd say this is where a calculation could. I could say calc 50% plus 200. So what this means is whatever the width of the page, the whole page is, divide that by 2, since it's based on percentages, and then add 200 on top of that. All right, so let's try this out. This is exercise 9. I'm going to come in here, and just to give you an idea, this entire document is, let me try to set it exactly to 1200. So the width is exactly 1200. Okay. So if the width is exactly 1200, half of 1200 should be 600, right? And then you add 200, and that should make this 800. And then it's close enough. There you go. I'd have to get rid of some of this is the padding. I'd have, if I really wanted to do that, I could do this. Get rid of the, reset the padding and the margin and everything. There you go. Now it's 800. There you go. So, and as this, my page gets bigger or smaller, this always remains at least half plus 200. Okay. Or maybe I always want it to be, I don't know, 100% of the page minus 50 for whatever reason. So I could say, well, the width is always 100% minus 50 pixels. So I come back. So obviously here, there's this is more of a space as this gets bigger. It's still 100% minus 50. So it's still there. It's just, a little bit smaller. Okay. Couple other functions we can take advantage of. One is called min and one is called max. Okay. What min does is you can set your element, you can give it 2 values and it will take the smaller of the 2 values, the minimum. Okay. So once again, I got a div here and I'm just going to give it a background color of aqua. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say min as a function, and I'm going to say 1,000 pixels and 800 pixels. Okay. Now, what this means is that of the 2, choose the smallest value. Okay. Now, 800 is less than 1,000. So what that means is that my div should get the width of 800, right? So I'm going to come in here and preview this. And if I look at this div is 800. Okay. Now that's kind of obvious, right? Like obviously if you have two literal numbers, it's very obvious which is the smaller number. But sometimes what we might try to do with this and why people would is we can use percentages. What if I were to say choose the minimum value here, 50% or 800? Now, normally 50% of the page might be smaller, but as your page gets bigger, 50% might be more than 800. If my page gets wider than 1600, then actually this would be smaller, right? So actually, maybe I'll make it like this. I'll do it like 75%. Let's either 75% of the page or 800. Okay. So what I'm going to do is preview this or refresh this. So right now it's still 800 because that's the smaller of the value. But if I make this like this, now what's happening here, you'll notice that this is getting smaller because 75% of, whatever this is, 75% of 800 is 600, and that's less than 800. But as this gets bigger, then this gets kind of locked in. Okay. Now, why this might be kind of useful is in design, like, let's say this is like my website. Maybe when it gets, maybe I don't want my website to be more than 800 pixels in terms of its width. But as it gets smaller, I don't want it to, if I just had it like this, where it's 800, as this gets smaller, what's happening is this is getting cut off, right? So what I could do is something like this, where I'm going to use the min, and I might say something like, 95% or 800. And what this means is choose the smaller of two values. So when my browser is bigger, 800 is the smaller of the two values. And so this doesn't grow beyond a certain point. But as I get smaller, the 95% is going to be the smaller value. And then I kind of get this thing where it's kind of resizing it. And so this is what we would call kind of a responsive design. It's using the 95% now. And then at a certain point, it just kind of stops and I don't get that. Okay. So you can see how this could be kind of useful for doing some minor layout issues there. Last thing I'll talk about is the max. And max is kind of the opposite, where instead of doing the minimum, taking the minimum value, it's going to take the maximum value. So if I say max 1,800, what it's going to do is figure out which of the two values is bigger and take that as the value. So in this case, which is bigger, 1,800? The obvious answer is 1,000. So if I were to save, let me get rid of all the padding and everything, just so the numbers are correct. If I were to preview this, this should be 1,000 because 1,000 is the bigger of the two values, and this is. Now, of course, we're not going to put in two values like this because it's obvious which is the bigger of two values this way. But I could do something like this where it's like, we'll take the maximum, I don't know, either I want to use 800 or I want it to be 50%, whichever is the bigger value. What this means is that if 50% ever gets smaller than 800, then this is the one that's going to be given. So if I come into here, this is now locked to a current 800. If I click on this, you can see that. But if I got smaller, oops. Actually, let's make it more like 90. So what this means is that it's going to be locked there, but then as it gets bigger, you can see how I've switched over from the finite value to the bigger number. Okay. All right, so I mean, the thing is there's a lot of functions like this, and I'm not going to go over every function, and you don't even have to use them if you don't want to. It's just that they might be useful to you. Okay, so I just want you to understand what a function is. So if you see something like this, you kind of understand that it's performing a task. Okay, and the task is to figure something out, which is the smaller or bigger number, that kind of thing, calculating something, that sort of thing. Okay.